Today, we're going to dig into a single document that literally drew lines on maps, redefined homelands, and, in the end, decided whose story would become history. We're going to see how a conflict over land in colonial Kenya became a battle over the very nature of truth itself.
You know, it all boils down to this one fundamental question. When two groups claim the exact same piece of land, and each one has a totally different story about who was there first, whose version of the past actually gets written into law?
Okay, so let's get right into it. The document we're zeroing in on is the 1933 Kenya Land Commission report. Now, this wasn't just some dusty old report. It was a major attempt by the British colonial government to settle land disputes once and for all. But it's how they did it and what they considered to be evidence that had consequences that are still felt today.
So here's our game plan. We'll start with what this commission actually was. Then we'll dive into the two clashing types of evidence they had to deal with, native oral history versus European written records. We'll see how they tried to weigh these totally different claims, look at the final verdict, and then think about the massive legacy of their methods.
All right, let's set the stage. Picture this. It's the early 1930s in colonial Kenya. Tensions over who owns what land are at a boiling point. So the government decides it needs a final, definitive solution.
So, they create this commission, led by a guy named Sir Maurice Carter. And its job, its mandate, was crystal clear. Investigate all the competing land claims and make recommendations. They were supposed to hear from everyone, native communities, European settlers, government officials, and then create a final, binding report. The goal was to just settle this thing for good.
First up, let's look at the evidence from the African perspective. For many tribes, like the Kikuyu and the Maasai, history wasn't something you'd find written in a book. It was a living, breathing thing passed down from one generation to the next. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The commission held these big public meetings called Barazzus. A witness would stand up and give their testimony, and then the commissioners would literally turn to the whole crowd and ask, "Hey, do you all agree with this?" The idea was to find a consensus, a history that was held collectively in the memory of the people. It's like they were crowdsourcing the past.
And this quote from Chief Njeri just says it all, doesn't it? His claim isn't based on a piece of paper, a deed, or a map. It's based on ancestral knowledge. Our grandfathers used to tell us. This is history as an oral tradition, a chain of memory stretching back through time.
Okay, so now let's flip the coin and look at the other side. Because in stark contrast to these oral histories, the commission also had a mountain of paper evidence, the kind colonial administrators were, let's just say, a lot more comfortable with.
And this included pretty much everything you can imagine. Official government files, letters, books written by settlers, and this is a huge one, the journals and maps made by the very first European explorers who had just passed through the area a few decades earlier. This was a history held in ink and paper.
And here's the rub. This is where the conflict becomes so clear. The stories told by all these documents, they often flat out contradicted the oral histories of the native communities.
Let's zoom in on one piece of evidence that was a real game changer, a map. It was reconstructed by the Colonial Survey Department, and it showed the route of a European explorer, Count Teleki, from way back in 1887. And the commission used this map to decide where people were, or more importantly, where they weren't, living at that time.
So what did Teleki's journal actually say? Well, while the Kikuyu are claiming ancestral ownership going back generations, Teleki, who's basically just a tourist passing through for a very short time, writes in his journal that he traveled through an uninhabited district, an empty land. So you've got two completely different realities, the ancestral homeland described by Chief Njeri and this empty space described by a fleeting traveler.
So this is the million-dollar question, right? How did the commission decide between these two completely opposite versions of the past? I mean, how do you weigh a collective memory against a single map?
Well, you won't believe it, but they tell us exactly how they did it, right there in the report itself. They said they used their own experience as the ultimate filter. Just think about that. This means the personal understanding and worldview of 3 British commissioners became the standard against which all evidence, oral and written, was judged.
Let's look at a really concrete example to see how this played out, a place called the Thathini Salt Lick. Both the Kikuyu and Maasai claimed it. The Kikuyu evidence was an oral admission, a story about an old Maasai man who said it was theirs. The Maasai evidence, on the other hand, pointed to the physical remains of their settlements, their manyatas, in the area. It's a classic showdown of different kinds of proof.
So what broke the tie? Was it more oral testimony? An archaeological dig? Nope. The deciding factor was a piece of paper,
a note in a government file from a provincial commissioner, written 20 years earlier. In this colonial calculus, the written word, especially from an official source, held the ultimate weight, period.
So the Commission's final report wasn't just an academic exercise. Its conclusions had very real, very tangible consequences. We're talking about monetary values and actual lines drawn on the map. First, let's look at personal loss. For Native people who were found to have been kicked off their own cultivated gardens, the compensation was set at just 2 rupees per acre. Think about that for a second. 2 rupees for a family's source of food, their livelihood. That's how their loss was valued.
Okay, what about ancestral rights? For an entire community that was found to be living as of right on land that was now owned by settlers, the total compensation to completely extinguish those rights forever was a single lump sum, 2,000 pounds.
And finally, the grand total. After weighing all this history, all these claims, the Commission's final recommendation was that just under 2,200 acres should be added back to the Kikuyu territory. That was it. That single number was the tangible, lasting outcome of this whole entire process.
So, let's pull all of this together. What is the real lasting legacy here? I mean, why does this nearly century-old report still matter so much?
Well, the Commission didn't just settle land claims. It codified a very specific version of history into law. It was a version where the journal of a passing European explorer could somehow outweigh generations of oral tradition. It created an official past where evidence was defined as something that was written down, preferably by a colonial official.
And that leaves us right back where we started, with the same question, but now it has all the weight of this history behind it. When we look at any historical dispute, we have to ask what was counted as evidence, what was dismissed, and whose story, in the end, won the power to call itself the truth.